Welcome to Stormwater Awareness Week. So we hope you guys have had a good week of learning here during Stormwater Awareness Week. I know I've enjoyed the programs that I've been able to participate in, and I'm really excited about this program. So we've invited Laurel and Amy from the State Water Board to come and talk about the construction general permit. What does the future of the CGP look like? You know, is there any might the permit be reissued in the future, or how does that all look? So yeah, so okay, let's have fun. So Amy, I don't think we've had you here on the studio before, so tell us, what's some of your experience? What do you do at the water boards?
Sure. I've been in the stormwater field for about 10 years. Okay. I worked in municipal stormwater at the water board. Okay. And then moved to New Mexico and did ran a municipalities stormwater program in New Mexico. And then came back about 2 years ago, and I've been working in the construction industrial unit with Laurel since then.
Nice. Nice. And you were telling me beforehand about New Mexico, how they've got strange storms over there, and it's totally different than California.
It makes it really interesting to do stormwater when you have monsoonal rains in the summer in a desert. It's very different.
So, Laurel and Amy, what are we looking at? What's the status of the construction general permit? What are we, you know, since the permit's been reissued, how many years has it been now?
It's been a long time. It was reissued in 2009. Okay. And it expired in 2014. Okay. But it's been administratively extended. So the permit is ready to be reissued.
Okay. So talk to me through the permit, like from a water board's perspective, what worked with the permit? Are there things that you're reconsidering? Have you know, the stormwater threats from construction projects changed, or you know, are there concerns that have changed, or are there things that have been improved on?
Yeah, I think that the current construction permit made leaps and bounds from the permit that preceded it, and we've seen a lot of great work on controlling sediment discharges. We've seen training programs get rolled out that have been very effective. We have seen action levels come into play that really give feedback to the regulated community on how their projects are performing. But we do still have some work to go. And with this reissuance, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're really trying to clarify things that have been made our job difficult for implementation or made it confusing for the regulated community. And we're also looking to tweak the training program a little bit. We actually had some of that language go out to the construction subcommittee for CASQA, the California Stormwater Quality Association. Mm-hmm. And so they've been helping us, that technical advisory on that language. Okay.
Some of the things that we've done well are electronic reporting. So that will stay. We'll continue to do that and then continue to improve on that as much as possible. And we've done a relatively good job of controlling sediment. Okay. And so we're looking in the reissuance and just in the future to look at things like non-visible pollutants. Yeah. And how we're controlling those. Okay.
Yeah. And building off what Amy said about the sediment, what worked really well was the risk structure. So having a tiered approach to controlling discharges from a site, depending on their risk to water quality, it gave flexibility to the dischargers as well as was appropriate for that type of site. Yeah.
Were there any specific areas that you guys felt were, you know, as a water board, were a little disappointing that didn't play out as you expected?
Yes, there were a few. I think the rain event action plans in concept were really a good idea, and I think it made people plan for pre-storm and storm events. But in reality, it might be something that we reconsider. And we got a low turnout on the bioassessment. And so some of the work that Amy's doing in the new permit will be tied to that bioassessment reevaluation. So that's a really big one. We surprisingly spent a lot of time on the active treatment system language, but we don't have a lot of those sites because of the cost. So we don't have a lot of active treatment system facilities being used. Okay. Now, you guys mentioned a new permit, so it sounds like there's talk of maybe the permit gets reissued in the future. So do you have any insights on
when that would be? What do you have a timeline by any chance? Or?
We do. We didn't bring it today. I know that would be really exciting if we did, but we do have a schedule.
Okay.
And we really want to get the permit out. I think that it's time to get the permit out, get some real feedback from people in California on what they think the permit should look like, how they see some of the proposed changes we're going to be putting out to the public. Amy, do you want to tell them the big news?
Sure. The reissuance of the permit can be expected to be out for public comment late 2019, early 2020.
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay, so we're about a year out. So what do you have a anticipated renewal date? We'd be talking a couple years out if everything goes well?
We don't have an anticipated date.
Okay.
It follows the public process.
Yeah.
Which can take time and can change.
Okay.
So what you'd be expecting is we go through the regional boards in our internal stakeholder process, and then we do a public stakeholder process. Depending on how the public stakeholder process goes, you could have 1 or 2 public comment periods, depending on the significance of the changes we're making and how the public feels about those and the concerns they have. We usually do a lot of outreach in that period to explain the language and get feedback. And then we actually have a formal hearing at the board. So the public comes and speaks in front of the board, and then they submit written comments to the board, and then the staff address those concerns. So if all that goes well and the stars align, then we get to an adoption process. But, the state board and the regional boards really uphold the public process as an agency. And so that's always long. It takes time. And, especially if there's holidays in between comment periods, we try to give people ample time to look at the changes.
So it sounds like there's a lot that needs to take place before the new permit is renewed.
Yes.
Or the permit is renewed, I should say. Okay.
Yes, definitely.
So you guys mentioned the construction permit training team. Now, I know I do a lot of work with the industrial permit, and I know we have the industrial general permit training team. What is the construction general permit training team? Are they kind of do the same thing but for construction?
Yes, and this is a really good question because there are a couple teams that that Amy and I are involved in. So there's and I already used the acronym, but CASQA, the California Stormwater Quality Association. We try not to use acronyms.
Okay.
We have so many.
There's a lot of them.
And there could be 2 CASQAs out there, who knows? But so CASQA has subcommittees for all these major stormwater permits. And one of their subcommittees is the Construction General Permit Subcommittee. Many of those same people are on the Construction General Permit Training Team, and the Construction General Permit Training Team is a separate state water board CASQA project where it's like a technical advisory. So when the training program gets revamped or there's changes or feedback, that team convenes and looks at what would need to happen to make that project a success. So right now the most active team is the construction subcommittee from CASQA. But we will be, especially through this reissuance, be convening that CGP training team again. So
what is the role, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but what's the role of the training team in regards to the permit when it's reissued? Do they have a specific role?
They do. We have it's like a memorandum or an agreement basically when that team was formed back in probably 2008, 2009 area. And so they formed to create the qualified SWIP developer and qualified SWIP practitioner training. And then what they did is they developed that content and they designed how that training would be provided to the QSDs and QSP candidates, how students would receive that information, and it was a very large project. And so they put that together. So what they would be doing is helping the state water board and the regional boards reevaluate that training for changes to match the permit.
So let's go back a little bit when you guys were talking about the public comment period. Maybe let's talk about how does the public get their hands on the proposed new permit when you guys release it in late 2019, early 2020, and how did they get their 2 cents in to you guys, and how does that whole process work?
Sure. So when we do release it for public comment, it goes out in a number of ways. typically through a Lyris list, which is like a listserv mailing list.
Okay.
Yeah. Also released on our website, and then often in some kind of media, whether it's a newspaper, you know, a local newspaper in different parts of the state.
Okay.
But also through email.
Okay.
And we have to develop a notice. It's an official notice that goes through those processes.
Okay. Okay. So let's talk now about the anticipated new permit.
Sure.
What are some anticipated changes that you guys foresee implementing in the permit when it's renewed? So
we've presented on the scope of the permit a few times. So this is something that we can talk about in general.
Okay.
One of the big ones is total maximum daily load implementation for the first time. So that isn't just a clarification, that's actually new requirements. There are the passive treatment requirements. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so we'll be clarifying how passive treatment chemicals are regulated in the permit.
Yeah.
And what types of treatment practices and BMPs and in what scope they're used.
Yeah. Okay.
And some of the concerns with those chemicals, they dovetail with the TMDL drivers as well as some of the bioassessment reevaluation. So it's all going to make sense when you see it. We're also looking at, do we need to revamp any language for the fire response? There are some areas that are less new. They're just clarifications.
Okay.
So pulling in the United States EPA effluent limitation guideline criteria, looking at our old frequently asked questions and seeing how we can clarify those things that people have brought up in years past. And the training program is going to be, it's not going away, but it's going to be tweaked.
Yeah.
And then we're looking at some other changes to the monitoring potentially.
So, Amy, you mentioned passive treatment. Maybe we should clarify what are passive treatment chemicals? What would they be used for?
Sure. It's not a real black and white clarification. It makes it really interesting.
Yeah.
So we have active treatment systems, and we have language in the permit that talks about those and how they're regulated, and they have their own numeric limits, etc. Passive treatment is typically those same types of chemicals used outside of an active treatment system, and they can be
just
used,
like on the ground?
Yeah, they can be used as BMPs to control erosion or in sediment ponds to flocculate out sediment.
Okay, so we're actually talking like spreading a flocculant substance on the ground or something.
Yeah, and they'll put it in, like Amy said, they'll put it in best management practices like a flock block or a wattle. They have treated wattles that are deployed at a site.
And also sometimes in tackifiers.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. For sure. Okay. What about, one of the things that we've been wondering is QSP, QSD certifications. I've heard, being in the industry, I've heard a lot of people complain about the underlying certification options, and they feel a little limited. Is there any, you guys considering any other options for applying for the QSD, QSB certification?
So we're open to changes to that if we can get that information. We honestly haven't had a succinct or formal or even cohesive recommendation on that. We don't get a lot of calls on it. We don't get a lot of emails where people aren't able to become a QSD or QSP because of a barrier like that. We have over 3,000 of these professionals right now. So yes, but we would need the information. So I think this could go two ways. We could get that information informally if there are some real concerns people have. We could also get formal comments, written comments from the training professionals or the public on that. So we're definitely open to it. We don't mean it to be restrictive. It's just the list we have.
Okay, and how would, if somebody had an idea for, maybe a certification that would meet that, how would they go about presenting that to the water board for consideration?
You could email Amy.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
As simple as an email, phone call, and then we would take it probably to the training team and discuss it there.
Okay, and you can find your contact information, all the water board's contact information on the water board's website, right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
That's correct.
Cool.
And she is the construction permit lead. So
Yes.
it's up on the webpage.
Yeah. Absolutely. So speaking of QSPs and QSDs, another area of concern that I've seen as a consultant is when it comes down to actually implementing, the QSD develops the SWIP, and the QSP is the one who's implementing it out on the project. When it comes down to that implementation stage, sometimes seems like there's a bit of a communication breakdown, or the BMPs that were called out in the SWIP aren't seen on the project. How did that work? Is there going to be does the new permit have any language maybe to address that, or what are you guys' take on that?
We've definitely heard that feedback before about the 2009 permit and how it's working out in the field, and so the reissuance will address some of that communication and clearly define the roles of both the QSD and the QSP.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be really important, especially if we're doing higher level requirements for passive treatment, total maximum daily loads. People really need to communicate with what BMPs they're required to implement from the SWIP, how they're doing that, and who's responsible.
Okay. So speaking of QSPs, part of the role of the QSP is to collect water samples. What is the water board want to see when it comes to testing for turbidity and pH at a construction site? And are there going to be any changes in the future? Do you guys foresee any changes, or do you have any comments on that?
Well, with the pH and turbidity, the reason that those are in there, as many people know, is they're quick. They're quick feedback to see, do you have something that is highly acidic or highly basic leaving your site? For example, concrete. That would be an indicator to go figure out why, because there's a lot of subcontracting at construction sites.
Yeah.
The second thing with the turbidity is it's a real-time feedback on, are your BMPs working for sediment? And so the reason we have those two indicator parameters are their field measurements, and it's to help the actual site improve their BMPs as fast as possible.
Yeah.
It's a different driver when you look at non-visible pollutants. Those are more water quality, long-term impacts potentially, and evaluating that, which is coming into play more in the next permit potentially.
Okay.
If that answers the question.
Well, and how does it play out? I know a lot of QSPs are covering multiple sites. How do the sampling requirements play out? Like, say, you can't wait to see when the discharge begins for this. You might be an hour down the road at the other project that you're working on. How does that all work?
So with the requirements in the current permit, they're supposed to avoid some of that with the rain gauge, having a half-inch event. It helps you plan. You should know what sites discharge at half-inch and which ones don't. It's part of the planning and understanding the site. But still, it is something that we deal with do you have enough people to get out to all those sites if it's a really large event?
Yeah.
So we're open to changing things that are difficult in the current permit if they make sense. So I'm assuming that we'll get a lot of that type of feedback when we put the document out to the public, and we'll be looking at that, I'm sure, with the stakeholders.
Okay.
There's a lot of little nuances about the monitoring that come up pretty routinely, so we're aware that the monitoring should be tweaked.
Yeah.
We get a lot of different reasons answers how to do it.
I'm sure.
Things that need to be tweaked, and so holistically we would come together and see what type of comments we get.
Okay. And Amy, you mentioned non-visible pollutant monitoring now, or non-visible pollutant sampling quite a few times, but I've heard that it's a good idea, but it's kind of, some people aren't following through with that when they should be.
It's an existing requirement in the CGP, and we haven't seen people really implementing that.
Yeah.
And so with the theme of the reissuance sort of being, let's make this doable and easier and more efficient, we're going to tweak that language to make sure that non-visible pollutant monitoring is happening.
Okay. Yeah. So,
I mean, and it could go two ways with that. When you have non-visible data, it can show where there are issues, like what are the other pollutants that really are tied to construction. Mm-hmm. If they've identified this pollutant, what does that data look like? So it can, in the future, help us write better permits to regulate construction, or if there are people or stakeholders out there that believe these pollutants are coming off a site, it's helpful to say yes or no, mm-hmm. Because right now there's not a lot of information.
Yeah. And maybe we should talk about what is non-visible pollutant sampling, when mm-hmm. is it triggered, that sort of thing, just a refresher. Maybe sure. People, they're not doing it, so maybe they just don't know what it is.
I think it's pretty general in the permit, and I think it was just it was a newer concept for construction potentially. Mm-hmm. And so in the permit it just says basically, and I don't have it in front of me, but you're supposed to do a pollutant source assessment of some kind for your construction pollutants that would be discharging, and you should be sampling and monitoring for those. Okay. And then, if there is a serious concern, you should have BMPs to control that.
Okay. And what would pretty simple. What would trigger? Because I know it's not or it isn't always for every rain event you're sampling for these pollutants. Sure. Are there triggers, like if you have a spill, then maybe you need to sample for your non-visible pollutant sampling now? So
what's interesting with the spill is you might want to, but it would be non-stormwater, so sometimes it's prohibited to discharge. Mm-hmm. So you'd have to look at the type of, spills, if you had a spill of oil and it actually reached to receiving water, I would say that's prohibited. Yeah. So it depends on the spill. You're supposed to clean it up. You're supposed to have BMPs to prevent spills, and you're supposed to have BMPs to control a release if you do have a spill.
Okay, and maybe I'm going back to a newsletter article that I read a while back. We were talking about, I've heard non-visible pollutant sampling called the oopsie sample. Okay. Like if you have a small spill and it's cleaned up, sure, but you still have to check for, is it there? Like, did we get all mm-hmm. of it? And you have to do the up gradient and the down gradient samples of that. How does that tie into non-visible pollutant sampling?
Well, I think the non-visible pollutant sampling and what we're saying today is, in general, assessing your pollutants mm-hmm. and then doing sampling mainly of the stormwater for that. Okay. Because many of the spills that you're referring to are BMP based or they're prohibited.
Okay, I see.
So then you have something like an authorized non-stormwater discharge, which is a little confusing in the current construction permit. And so we're not looking at sampling in particular for that unless the facility knows that they have a pollutant in that discharge, but they have to control those and meet the permit requirements to deem that authorized. Yeah. Because, one thing I hear a lot with these permits is, if I'm permitted, that means my discharges are permitted. We only permit a specific type of discharge mm-hmm. in this permit. So if you do other types of discharges, you might need a different permit, or it may not be allowed. Okay. So I see a lot of people think, well, if I have this permit, I can kind of discharge anything I want, and that's actually the opposite. This permit is actually very restrictive. It's only stormwater associated with construction activity and authorized non-stormwater, like a fire hydrant testing. Mm-hmm. So I think that's big picture wise, why there's a lot of controls on the non-visibles and the unauthorized discharges. Yeah, good to know. Mm-hmm. Good clarification.
So, REAPs. Let's talk a little bit about REAPs. What, some people say it's just a pencil whipping exercise. It might not be too much benefit in there, or so they say. Does the Water Board think this REAPs are a worthwhile activity, something that's going to appear in the next permit when it's reissued, or?
I think the intent of the REAPs was good. Uh-huh. We want you to be doing planning. Yeah. And knowing when storm events are going to happen. Yeah. And doing some kind of planning for those. Uh-huh. I think it hasn't worked out as well in real time through implementation. And so we'll be reevaluating what types of pre-storm activities and planning are needed in the reissuance.
And sometimes these new requirements come out and we see how the board uses them. And so if, say, the regional board said these REAPs are extremely useful and we use them a lot in our inspections, we would really consider keeping those. Or if they said, well, no, they're just not the tool that we thought they'd be, that would be something we'd reevaluate, because one thing we're trying to improve on is if we're collecting data or collecting information, we're trying to use what we collect. And we've done this in other permits where we change or shift the priority of reporting based upon what we're using and what we're not.
Okay. So it sounds like, another step back, broad, big picture, it sounds like planning and, knowing your site is really, it's vital.
It is.
A successful program.
Yeah. And I think a lot of sites, when we look at the stormwater pollution prevention plans, we don't approve them, as a board before they go into getting permit coverage. But when we do look at them, we see a lot of BMPs that aren't site specific, and they have a lot of blank pages or blank information. And it's really, this is a very mature program to be having that kind of information up front. And it shows that, wow, if you had a concern, how would somebody know that you're trying to address it or you have a plan to address it? And so holistically, I think there's gaps in implementation.
Yeah. So just sticking the permit in your SWIP binder isn't good enough?
No. You got to tie it back.
Good to know. So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned the electronic reporting a little bit, paper versus electronic. So the electronic's really working out. So might there be, if we can take that over to the SWIP side, we have right now, there's a lot of paper copies of SWIPs around. Might we start seeing maybe more digital SWIPs?
You mean at the construction site?
Yeah.
So right now the regulated community, the discharger, is supposed to submit their SWIP electronically in SMARTS when they file, and then they're supposed to keep a copy at their construction site until the project's terminated. So that, I think there's some clarification that needs to happen if that can be an electronic copy at the site or a paper copy. And right now I think the general trend is that it's a paper copy.
Yeah.
But we're open to electronic copies in the next permit and making that clear, as long as the inspector of any agency, the United States EPA, so federal, municipal, or state, can access that document.
Okay, can see it. Yeah.
Right. You can't have it as an electronic copy on your dog's collar running around your site. You need to be able to make sure that they can actually look at your documents if they're electronic.
And to make sure that the site personnel have access to that SWIP as
know
well.
where it is.
That's true.
So they know, what BMPs need to be out and how it's designed.
Yeah.
So.
It's on the server. But where on the server?
Right.
Yeah, it needs to be accessible.
Yeah.
So the document management electronically, I think there's more onerous on the discharger, because you can't just share it, like Amy's saying. That's a very good point.
Yeah. And what about inspections or inspection reports or even training rosters, training reports, things like that? Might we see those go digital too?
I think that the intent is if we can access it when we need it, we don't care if it's paper or electronic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because we can print it if we need it.
Okay.
I've seen a construction trailer, out in the middle of nowhere that wouldn't have access to Wi-Fi no matter how hard they tried. And so in that case, it might be easier for that construction site to have it on paper.
Yeah.
But it's not a mandate from us.
And you could, if I was a company looking at, doing a lot of construction in a certain region, I would ask them if they have a preference, for now until the new permit comes out.
Okay.
It's a good way for locally, just make sure your inspectors are happy. Do they prefer paper? Do they care if it's electronic? You can touch bases with them on a site-specific basis.
Yeah. Yeah. Choose a system that not only works for you, but works for the people who are actually reading the documents on the other end. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's spend some time on mandatory BMPs, because I know that there's been some pushback, people saying, certain BMPs are difficult or not, maybe don't make sense to implement. Like one that I hear a lot of time is washing out concrete chutes right next to, or pumping, washing out concrete equipment onto an area that might have fresh poured concrete on it just an hour later.
Oh, okay.
Or, things like that, or covering trash bins every day, or the containment of sanitation facilities, or the line in the permit, prevent disposal of any rinse or wash waters or materials on impervious or pervious site surfaces. So does the construction general permit training team and or the water board, are you guys in the process of reevaluating some of these mandatory BMPs? Are they going to change or be clarified, or?
I think there are some minimum BMPs that we will require.
Okay.
Each of them is to address a specific problem, or to meet some kind of, minimum requirement. And so we can certainly evaluate which ones are necessary.
Okay.
I think that was done the first time also, but they will still be there.
Okay.
Yeah, if there's some issue with one of the specific minimum BMPs or minimum BMP objectives, we can reevaluate that, especially if we get written comments or comments on that necessitating the change.
Yeah.
The other thing is with the other types of BMP guidance out there, or BMPs that are related to construction, we may not have we might not be the right role to update that type of guidance.
Okay.
It just depends on the specific issue.
Okay, and maybe this would be a good time to touch on what are helpful comments and what are not helpful comments during the commenting process.
That's a great point.
Oh man, how much time do we have? So one that I personally think is really helpful is when you say something doesn't work, you tell us how, and you give us examples or language. Give us the language of how to fix it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's an opinion, and it's not always very well thought out. It might just be someone frustrated.
Yeah.
So if you submit a comment that says this is really difficult, please tell us how so we can make it less difficult.
Yeah.
Because that's our job, is trying to make these permits function and implementable so that we protect water quality.
Yeah.
You have the top one, Amy?
The top.
For comments? Something that may be just not a very good comment or a good way to submit a comment?
Oh, we get a lot of different things. Sometimes it's just statements saying, this is garbage. It's not helpful.
No, it's not.
Yeah. we want to make it the best we can.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, and also if you can, another thing that works really well, and I see this with some of the larger lobby groups or industry representatives, construction or industrial, they get together and they form a group and they talk about the top priorities.
Okay.
So if we get these comment letters where there's 15, 20 parties and they all have one letter.
Yeah.
That's very strong. And I'm not saying the one letter from one person isn't just as valuable, but it helps us understand what industry as a whole is having a concern with.
Yeah.
So there are avenues that already exist for those types of groups, and there could be new ones. So it's always helpful.
Well, and it's good because I imagine you guys have a ton of comments to sift through. And
yes.
It kind of consolidates, and it shows you that they're actually thinking through what they want to say, what they want to present, and maybe a possible solution.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very helpful.
Okay. What about maybe a last question, numeric action levels and numeric effluent limits? Are there any thoughts on changing those in the revised or when the permit's reissued?
Sure. So right now we have numeric action levels just for the permit, and then we have numeric effluent limits only for active treatment systems. We would have to work internally to see if we're going to look at numeric effluent limits again in this permit. So it's possible.
Okay.
I can't say it isn't going to happen, and I can't say it is. And another factor of this is the total maximum daily loads coming into play. We're trying to do a best management practice based implementation for TMDLs. But if you've read a TMDL plan, they're adopted by the regional boards and they're put into these basin plans for that watershed or set of watersheds that the regional board has jurisdiction over. So these plans get implemented through our permits. They're already adopted and approved. We can't change them.
Yeah.
And so if they have specific requirements for construction, we're going to do what we can to implement those, but in the end of the day, we have legal obligations. So you might see some of that come out of the TMDLs or not. It depends on how that whole project comes out.
Okay, maybe I lied. It's not the last question. Maybe we should talk about the difference between NALs and NELs
Sure.
and TMDLs. How did those all fit together?
Sure. So NALs, numeric action levels, are numeric targets that you would have some response to. So if you reach a turbidity NAL, you then have to respond. It's part of a feedback loop. Numeric effluent limitations.
And it's not a permit violation.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. Numeric effluent limitations are hard and fast numbers that, if you exceed them, constitute a permit violation.
You got problems.
Yeah.
And there's an enforcement process to implement the enforcement of that numeric effluent limit.
Right. And then TMDLs are separate documents, like Laurel said, that are adopted by each regional board or the US EPA, and then ultimately approved by the EPA. And they have waste load allocations typically, which are sometimes numeric and sometimes narrative, depending on the pollutant, the watershed, and the source of the pollutants.
Okay.
And so some TMDLs for either a specific water body or a watershed could have a numeric waste load allocation that is very specifically listed for construction stormwater as its source.
Okay.
Yeah. And another question we get is, what's the relation between total maximum daily loads and impaired water bodies? So there's a 303D list. So the impaired water body list that we're required to implement from the Clean Water Act. So the state of California develops an impaired water body list every couple years. And that list says what water bodies in California are impaired and what type of action needs to happen or should happen to address that. So some will say, Ballona Creek impaired for metals, TMDL being implemented, TMDL needed, or other action needed, that type of language.
Yeah.
So what happens is those TMDL, the regional boards prioritize which TMDLs get actually adopted over time. They take a long time. They're their own public process. And then those get on, so those are implementing the impaired water body list.
Yeah.
And then they come to the permit process. So, and then we take all of that. So there's quite a process to get a TMDL into a permit. And that TMDL is supposed to address, once implemented, the impairments for all the sources in that watershed.
Okay.
So they're very specific to the watershed, like Amy said.
Okay. And maybe we should talk a little bit from a practical standpoint. When TMDLs are implemented, what might that look like? You know, if I'm regular Joe Schmo with my construction site, what do these TMDL requirements change for me?
It depends on the TMDL.
And where you're located,
so
right?
it could be, and I'm just going to do this in general, it could be that you have to put in more best management practices.
Okay.
You might have specific planning requirements in your SWIP. You might have to be doing additional monitoring. You might have additional targets or numerics tied to your discharge.
And it depends on the pollutant, the water body, your location.
Yeah. Okay.
But our goal is to make the TMDL requirements coming into this permit implementable and clear. And so we're striving for that goal.
Okay.
For construction.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys for participating with us in Stormwater Awareness Week 2018. I guess this is the last day of the event, so that about wraps it up for this year. So this has been a lot of fun. Thank you guys for coming out.
Thank you.
And we will see you guys next year, 2019.